He planned to leave me with nothing, until I shifted my entire empire overnight. That is the sentence everyone remembers, the one people repeat like a legend about a woman who saw the storm before the first drop of rain. But legends always start smaller than that. Before the empire moved, before the lawyers panicked, there was just a wife who loved too deeply, and a husband who thought she was too busy loving him to notice he was carefully unloving her back. What you are about to hear is not a story about money, not really. It is a story about miscalculation. A man who thought $500 million made him powerful, and a woman who knew that power is not in what you hold, but in what you are willing to walk away from when the truth finally introduces itself. There are marriages built on passion, and there are marriages built on paper. This one began with both. On their wedding day, the world saw a photograph that looked like a victory, a young couple on the steps of a stone church, his hand raised in triumph, her smile soft, almost shy, the kind of smile people mistake for dependency when they have never seen strategic kindness up close. Her name was Elena Caraway then, though the tabloids would later upgrade it to Elena Stoneheart, as if her heart needed a harder surface to match the numbers in her accounts. She came from a quiet kind of privilege, the kind that wears scuffed loafers and old wool coats, not logos. Her grandfather had owned a small shipping firm on the eastern seaboard, modest but steady, the kind of business that never made headlines and never missed payroll. From him she inherited two things: a portfolio no one took seriously and an obsession with how value moves when no one is watching. His name was Julian Stone. He arrived in her life like a well-rehearsed entrance. Scholarship boy, sharp jaw, sharper mind, the son of a mechanic who knew how to make broken engines roar again. By 28 he had learned to translate that skill into markets, coaxing weak companies into looking strong long enough for someone richer to overpay for them. He was the sort of man who could explain derivatives over dinner, and still make it sound romantic. People said they were a perfect match. She brought old family connections and quiet capital. He brought ambition like a jet engine. Together they would build something enormous. That was the story they told themselves. That was the story everyone wanted to believe. In the early years, their penthouse was not yet a penthouse. It was a high-floor apartment with a temperamental elevator and a view of the river that looked better at dusk. Elena worked late at a small investment firm no one remembers now, running spreadsheets until the cells blurred into a kind of digital fog. Julian worked later, chasing deals, meeting possibilities, learning which handshakes changed futures and which just exchanged germs. They came home to cheap pasta and second-hand furniture and the kind of tiredness that feels noble. On weekends they walked through parts of the city where the buildings did not yet know their names, and he would point at the skyline and say, "Someday, something with our initials on it." She would laugh and say, "Start with remembering our anniversary." It seemed harmless then, the way he confused milestones with acquisitions. The first real money did not arrive like a lottery win. It came in increments like a shy guest testing the doorway. Elena spotted an inefficiency in port logistics data: ships idling too long, containers misrouted because 3 different systems refused to talk to each other. While Julian dreamed of glamorous acquisitions, she quietly built a model that could predict, with unnerving accuracy, which routes would clog and which would clear. She invested through a family trust her grandfather had set up decades earlier and forgotten to brag about. Small stakes at first, then larger, buying not headlines but leverage. While others chased unicorns, she bought the fences they would one day have to pass through. Within 5 years, returns began to compound in the way that turns quizzes into midterms. Julian noticed, of course. He was not blind, only selective in what he chose to see. First, he celebrated her wins. It made them interesting at dinner parties. "My wife is the quiet genius," he would say, arms slung casually around her shoulders, eyes gleaming as the numbers tripped off his tongue. "She turned a dusty little trust into something Wall Street is starting to whisper about." People laughed, impressed. Someone always asked for a meeting. Elena would smile and demur. "It is just logistics," she would say. "The boring part of the world that keeps the glamorous part alive." It was true and untrue at once. Logistics is never boring when you understand that whoever controls the routes controls the pace at which everyone else must live. As the years passed, the dusty little trust transformed into an empire made of unremarkable names: mid-tier freight companies, obscure software providers, niche insurance outfits that only nerds and necessary people cared about. There were no flashy apps, no viral campaigns. Just contracts, routes, data, billions in goods moving through systems she could see 3 steps ahead of everyone else. By their 15th anniversary, the apartment had blurred into a penthouse without either of them noticing exactly when the transition occurred. The elevator no longer complained. The windows reached from floor to ceiling, and the river looked like a polished metal ribbon. The fridge held wine with labels that needed explaining. The furniture had learned how to be so comfortable it was almost rude. Somewhere along the way, the story of who made the fortune shifted. Not in reality, Elena's model still hummed quietly in the background, generating returns with the same unromantic reliability, but in perception. Julian's name was the one in the magazines, on the panels, in the visionary leaders under 50 lists that cycle through the internet like weather. He stood on stages and spoke about our proprietary investment lens. And when journalists asked how he'd managed to anticipate supply chain disruptions others missed, he smiled with that practiced humility and said, "I am lucky to be surrounded by brilliant people." He never said her name on stage. He said it at home sometimes, mostly when he wanted something. To the outside world, they were the Stone Empire. Julian, the charismatic face. Elena, the elegantly understated wife who chaired a philanthropic foundation and appeared in photographs beside hospital wings and arts programs that bore their names. People mistook her quiet for passivity. It is a common mistake. Quiet women are often underestimated by loud men. Inside the marriage, little cracks had already begun to appear. Not dramatic ones. Not yet. Just hairline fractures in the glaze of we. The day he forgot their 20th anniversary because he was closing a deal in Dubai and sent an assistant to deliver a necklace instead of coming home. The time she overheard him telling a banker, "She is not really interested in the numbers anymore. She is focused on the charity side." The way he flinched whenever anyone suggested they were partners in business, not just in photographs. Elena noticed. She always noticed. But noticing and deciding are 2 different verbs. In the 12th year, her mother died quietly in a coastal town 2 hours away, leaving behind a small house full of handwritten recipes and a garden that refused to apologize for its wildness. Elena spent 3 weeks sorting through the past, touching objects that still remembered hands now gone. Julian visited once, stayed 19 hours, and checked his phone for 18 of them. On the drive back to the city, Elena watched raindrops race down the window and thought, without bitterness, we have built something enormous, and somehow there is no room in it for simple grief. She wondered when exactly accumulating had replaced attending. Still, she did not move her money. Not yet. The empire grew. Market reporters started calling her the woman behind the throne. Half admiring, half dismissing, as if building the throne were less impressive than sitting on it. She ignored them. She had spreadsheets to rebalance, shipping routes to reroute, risk models to update as the world tried new ways to surprise itself. What she did not see at first was that Julian had begun building something of his own. Not a business. A narrative. In his version of the story, he was the architect and she was convenient. A gifted treasurer. A supportive spouse. A background genius who, if one squinted, could be written out without the numbers falling too much out of place. The first real sign came not in words but in paper. Thick, creamy paper, the kind lawyers use when they want their documents to feel like they could survive a fire. It arrived in a nondescript envelope that was supposed to go to his office but, in a glitch that would later feel like fate, landed in the home study instead. She found it on a Tuesday, the day she typically reviewed cash flow reports and commodity exposure before lunch. It lay there, half tucked under a stack of analyst notes. At first she thought it was another term sheet. She almost set it aside. Almost. Curiosity is not a sin. It is an instinct. She reached for it, intending only to set it neatly on his desk, but her eyes caught the heading by accident. 2 words, black ink, heavy with implications. Marital agreement. There are seconds in life when the air around a person crystallizes. The room was still the same study, with the same shelves of leather-bound complacency, the same view of the river, the same soft hum of the climate control system. But the world had reorganized itself around those 2 words. She could have put the envelope down. She could have waited for him to come home, asked questions in a calm voice, given him the chance to lie with style. But they had built an empire together on the principle that information, once available, must be read. Numbers do not reward the politely incurious. Her fingers slid the paper free. Language is its own kind of violence. The document was precise, clinical, full of clauses that looked neutral until you understood what they were amputating. It proposed a rearrangement of ownership structures. It clarified that several key holdings, companies she had found, acquired and nurtured, were primarily attributable to his strategic leadership. It suggested that, in the event of dissolution, these would remain under his control, consistent with their genesis. There, in the fourth paragraph, couched in legal politeness, was the sentence that stripped the story down to its bones. In light of the husband's predominant contribution to the marital estate, she stopped reading. Not because she could not handle the rest, but because she already understood it. The math was simple. He was planning a future in which her genius had been retroactively reassigned to him, and her half of the fortune had been quietly shrunk to something more manageable, more dismissible. The last page was unsigned. A note clipped to the corner, in the careful handwriting of someone paid too much to make mistakes. Mr. Stone, as discussed. Once executed, this will streamline subsequent proceedings. Subsequent proceedings. The phrase tasted like metal. Elena set the papers down, aligning their edges with an almost absurd neatness. Her heart did not race. Oddly, it slowed. The way a room goes quiet when the fire alarm stops screaming, and the smoke is finally visible. It would have been easy to crumble in that moment, to dissolve into the old myth of the blindsided wife who never saw it coming. But Elena was not blind, and she had spent 2 decades reading the fine print of other people's desperation. She recognized now that the cracks in their marriage had never been random. They were a blueprint. She walked to the window. The river moved below, indifferent, carrying barges loaded with containers whose routes she already knew by heart. Somewhere, halfway around the world, a ship she owned a piece of was unloading at a port she had quietly rescued from bankruptcy 3 years earlier. The Empire did not care what Julian thought. It only cared what she did next. Outside, the sky was the pale, expensive gray unique to cities built on financial arrogance. Inside, a woman who had built $500 million in value out of other people's inefficiencies stared at the reflection of her own face and saw, for the first time, not a supporting character but a central one. He planned to leave her with nothing. That was clear now. What he did not know, what he had never bothered to learn, was how thoroughly she understood the machinery of the world that had made him look powerful. Standing there, hands still faintly ink-dusted from the legal pages, Elena made no dramatic vow. She did not whisper revenge into the glass. She simply arrived at a decision that was less fury than calibration. If he was planning for subsequent proceedings, she would plan for something else entirely. Not a fight over what existed, but a reconfiguration of who truly owned the bones of the empire. In the distance, thunder grumbled over the river, the kind that announces a storm still 30 miles away. She watched the first flicker of lightning sketch the horizon and felt something within her align. This, she realized, was no longer just a marriage. It was a balance sheet. And for the first time, she would stop letting someone else mislabel her assets. By the time Julian returned that evening, shaking rain from his umbrella and complaining about traffic, the papers were back in their envelope, sitting exactly where she had found them. She greeted him as she always did, with a measured smile and a glass of the red wine he claimed helped him transition out of deal mode. He never noticed the faint new stillness in her eyes, the way a lake goes perfectly flat moments before a storm hits. He still believed he was the only one setting the terms. What he did not yet know was that, somewhere between the study and the window, his wife had stopped being a liability to be managed and become what she had always secretly been, the only person in the room who knew how to move $500 million without leaving fingerprints. And while he talked about his day and kissed her cheek and laid the groundwork for the divorce he thought would surprise her, Elena silently began tracing the map of her empire in her mind, node by node, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, like a general walking the terrain before a war. He planned to leave her with nothing. She was about to show him what happens when a man forgets who really owns the ground he is standing on. He planned to leave her with nothing. But a woman who builds an empire in silence learns early that silence is a weapon. That night, while Julian slept with the careless ease of a man convinced the world bends toward him, Elena sat in the glow of her laptop, the only light in the penthouse besides the river shimmer below. She didn't rush. Rushing is what amateurs do when they finally realize danger. Elena was not in danger. She was in transition. There on the screen were the blueprints of the life they had built, trusts, subsidiaries, holdings scattered across continents like seeds she planted years before. Most people who marry money think wealth is a tree, one trunk feeding many branches. But Elena had never grown trees. She had grown forests. Independent roots. Separate soil. Structures that looked connected but could survive on their own if the canopy ever fell. Her mistake, if it could be called that, was allowing Julian to believe the forest belonged to him. A man who benefits from someone else's brilliance will always assume the brilliance was mutual. He thought her calm was simplicity. He thought her quiet agreement was agreement at all. He thought her decision to let him shine meant she didn't understand how blinding the light could be when turned in the wrong direction. The cursor blinked at her like a heartbeat. She clicked open the first ledger, Caraway Holdings, ledger, Caraway Holdings. 57% of the empire's liquidity had passed through it at some point in the last decade. On paper it was joint interest, but anyone who understood the underlying mechanics knew the numbers didn't come from Julian's strategies. They came from her algorithms, her timing, her ability to sense which markets were about to tighten and which were about to sigh with opportunity. The first transfer was easy. Not even a transfer, merely a redirection written into an agreement she drafted years ago, back when she still believed in shared futures. A clause buried under amendments, designed originally to protect the estate from market collapse. She built it as insurance. Tonight it became a lifeline. A click. A confirmation. Caraway Holdings quietly shifted its entire portfolio into a protective trust held under her maiden name, untouchable by marital claims, shielded by jurisdictional laws Julian had never bothered to learn because he assumed she hadn't either. The world didn't shift. The room didn't tremble. The river didn't pause in its flow. But something inside her exhaled, long and deep, like a truth that had been holding its breath for too many years. She moved to the next set of companies. These required finesse. Julian had fingerprints on these, faint but present enough that any movement had to look like strategy, not fear. Elena composed a message to a board member in Singapore, instructing a routine quarterly audit, something she typically scheduled 2 months ahead. But tonight she made it urgent. Audits justify freezes. Freezes buy time. Time opens doors for redirection masked as structural review. Her fingers danced. Quiet instructions logged at 1:42 a.m. were routed through encrypted channels that bankers respect because money respects complication. Audit triggers set. Reports ordered. Funds locked from non-essential access. Which, as written in the bylaws she herself drafted, included spouses attempting to exercise discretionary claims during periods of financial reassessment. She paused only once, when she glimpsed their wedding photo still set as the tiny thumbnail in the corner of her desktop. The younger version of herself stood there laughing at something Julian whispered, her hand resting lightly on his chest, trusting the man beneath it. Trust is a form of wealth. And like all wealth, it can evaporate if left unwatched. She closed the image without enlarging it. At 2:07 a.m. she opened the deepest vault, the shipping intelligence network she built long before anyone realized supply chains were fragile enough to bring nations to their knees. This was the heart of the empire. Not the money itself, but the map that made the money possible. Real-time data, licensing agreements, exclusive insight contracts with ports from Lisbon to Busan. Without this network, Julian's business appearances would collapse like stage sets pushed by wind. This part required precision. She drafted a memorandum to 12 key partners. Nothing dramatic, just a notification of restructuring in anticipation of future expansion. She signed it with her personal identifier, one they all recognized. Most of them had never even met Julian. In their world, Elena was the force, the brain, the reason their ships arrived on time, and their profits stayed steady when others drowned in volatility. By 2:30 a.m., the empire had shifted without a single alarm. The legal ownership looked the same on the surface, soothing, stable. But beneath it, threads had rerouted, foundations had tilted, power had returned to the hands that had always held it, even when she pretended otherwise. She closed her laptop and sat for a moment, listening. The penthouse was silent except for Julian's muffled breathing down the hall. She wondered whether he'd practiced the speech he intended to give her when he filed. Something polished, something rehearsed, Something softened with the kind of pity men use when they want to appear noble while being cruel. She turned off the lamp. The next morning was sunny, disgustingly so. The type of sunny that makes skyscrapers gleam like false promises. Julian kissed her cheek before leaving. Habit, routine, muscle memory, not affection. She felt none of the old stirrings of guilt. He had made his choice long before he requested that document. She was simply making hers. By noon the first bank called. Mrs. Stoneheart, we're simply confirming the audit freeze. Is this your directive? Yes, she replied calmly. Proceed. The second call came at 12:47 p.m. Mrs. Stoneheart, our Singapore liaison has received unusual requests for reallocation. Do you authorize? Yes. The third call didn't ask for permission. It simply informed her that her newly structured trust, shielded, silent, airtight, had been processed and verified. She thanked them. What she did not know was that Julian was learning of these changes in real time from the opposite direction. He was in a meeting when his assistant knocked quietly, interrupting him with the urgency she usually saved for market crashes. Your access to Caraway Holdings was denied, sir. Julian blinked. Denied? That's impossible. Try again. She tried. He watched her screen from across the table, irritation blooming into confusion sharpening into the faintest tremor of fear. Try the logistics account, he ordered. She tried. Denied. The port analytics license? Denied. Something icy slid down his spine. Who authorized the freeze? He demanded. His assistant swallowed. Your wife, sir. There are moments in life when a man realizes he has underestimated the wrong person. Julian felt the first of those moments unfurl in the center of his chest like smoke. His lawyer called next, voice clipped. Julian, I'm going through the structure now. Whatever she moved, she did it legally. If you sign the dissolution as drafted, you'll get very little. Fix it, he hissed. I can't fix what's no longer yours. Julian felt the world tilt. For 20 years, he thought he'd been married to a gentle storm cloud. A woman who draped herself in softness. A woman so quiet she must be fragile. He had forgotten that storms don't announce themselves. They gather. They darken. And when they strike, it is always decisive. By the time he got home that night, the empire was already gone. Not destroyed, simply no longer reachable, no longer manipulable, no longer available for extraction. It had gone back to the hands that built it. He found Elena in the kitchen, slicing lemons into a glass pitcher like a woman who had spent the day doing absolutely nothing unusual. He stared at her. We need to talk, he said. She looked up, serene, the way the ocean looks just before it swallows a ship whole. Yes, she replied. I think we do. He stood there in the kitchen doorway, rain still clinging to his coat, breathing as if the air were thinner than it had ever been. Elena poured water over the lemons, each slice drifting upward like memory fragments rising from the deep. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. Calm is the final luxury of people who have already made their decisions. Julian's eyes searched her face for something familiar, something he could still use, but he found only stillness. And nothing terrifies an unsteady man more than a steady woman. You moved everything, he said finally. Not angry, not shocked, just hollow. Elena set the pitcher down gently, the faint clink of glass against marble echoing between them like a small, deliberate bell. I protected what was already mine. He stepped closer. You blindsided me. She almost smiled. Almost. No. You tried to blindside me. I simply stepped out of the load. His throat clicked like a hinge needing oil. We're married. We were, she corrected softly. Right up until you drafted a document erasing me from the life I built. Julian felt himself shrink just slightly, the way a man shrinks when the truth fits him too tightly. He opened his mouth to speak, but Elena turned and walked past him, moving through the penthouse with a grace that used to fascinate him before he decided ownership would feel easier than admiration. He followed, unsure whether he was chasing her or chasing the version of himself he used to be when she still looked at him with unguarded faith. In the living room, the city glowed through the tall glass walls, lights flickering like distant warnings. She stood near the window, her silhouette outlined by reflections of a life neither of them recognized anymore. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Why didn't you? She replied. He bristled. It wasn't personal. A single eyebrow lifted. You tried to take $500 million from your wife, Julian. What exactly would you call personal? He looked away. Shame is a heavy mirror, and he was not brave enough to face his reflection. Not yet. Elena. I was trying to protect myself. From what? She asked quietly. From the woman who built your reputation? From the models you claimed as your own? Or from the possibility that people would discover the truth, that you've been standing on a mountain I built grain by grain? His jaw tightened. You don't know what it's like to feel powerless. She almost laughed, but sadness softened the edge. I was a woman married to a man who took credit for the world I created. I know exactly what powerless feels like. I just never let it keep me there. He paced now, a caged movement, a man not used to hallways he did not control. This isn't what I wanted, he muttered. She tilted her head. Then why did you plan a divorce without speaking to me? He whispered. I saw every step, she said. Every meeting. Every whisper. Every moment you practiced pretending this was mutual. A man rehearsing betrayal is always sloppy in the end. He rubbed his forehead. So you punished me. No, she answered. I liberated myself. What you call punishment is simply consequence. Julian sank into the sofa, the same one they once picked out on a Sunday morning filled with optimism and croissants. It looked different now, colder, too large for the room, as if it were tired of holding two versions of a marriage. Elena, we built a life together. We built a facade together, she corrected. The life I built alone. He pinched the bridge of his nose. I made mistakes. You made decisions, she replied. Mistakes are accidents. Choices were signed into your contract. Something inside him broke. Not loudly, not theatrically, but quietly, the way a rope snaps underwater where no one can hear it. Elena, he looked up at her, and for the first time in years she saw the boy he once was. The one who dreamed without cruelty. The one who used ambition, not as a weapon but as a ladder. Can we fix this? She approached slowly, stopping an arm's length away. Fixing requires truth. Not just mine, yours. He swallowed again. I panicked. The board wants a stronger narrative. Investors expect a clean hierarchy. I felt like everything was slipping out of my hands. And instead of holding on to me, she said, you tried to cut my hands off. He closed his eyes. She breathed in, steady, unwavering. Julian, the world you wanted. It doesn't exist without me. And the world I built doesn't need you. That's not cruelty. That's architecture. The silence stretched, long and unforgiving. Finally, she sat across from him. Not beside him, not close enough to soften anything. She wanted him to no longer be crossed. I'm not here to hurt you, she said gently. But I won't be hurt by you either. He looked up sharply. So what now? You walk away? Just like that. She shook her head. I walked away years ago. Tonight is simply the paperwork. His breath hitched. You're leaving. I'm choosing myself, she corrected. Something I should have done sooner. He stared at her. This woman he thought he understood, thought he owned, thought he could outmaneuver. She looked calm, radiant even, the way people look when they've stepped into the truth without seeking anyone's permission. Elena, he whispered, voice breaking, I don't want to lose you. Her eyes softened, not from pity but from recognition. You already did. A tear escaped him. Unexpected, quick, immediately wiped as though he still believed dignity required dryness. She stood, adjusting the sleeve of her blouse with the quiet composure of someone preparing for a new life. You'll be fine, Julian, she said. But you will have to learn how to stand without leaning on what wasn't yours. And us, he whispered. She paused. There is no us, she said softly. There is only the truth we avoided, and the future I'm no longer sharing with you. She walked past him, heading toward the study where her suitcase waited, packed hours before he arrived, placed on the chair like a final punctuation mark he never saw coming. He turned desperate now. Where will you go? She looked over her shoulder. Where I should have been all along, into a world I built with my own hands. She didn't slam the door. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look back. Queens don't make noise when they leave. They carry their silence like a crown. She didn't look back when she left the penthouse, but the night remembered her. The city stretched before her like an unrolled map, the streets glistening after fresh rain, neon lights flickering against puddles that felt like themselves. She walked with the steady rhythm of a woman who had finally stepped out of someone else's shadow and discovered her legs had always been strong enough to carry an empire. Her driver stood waiting at the curb, but she didn't enter the car right away. She let the air touch her, cool, unscripted, honest. For the first time in years, no one expected anything from her. No board. No shareholders. No husband. Her life, which had been partitioned into tidy demands, now stretched open like a horizon. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked. She could have given an address. She could have chosen one of the properties she owned, townhouses, villas, quiet estates designed to impress guests she no longer cared to entertain. But tonight she wanted nothing curated, nothing manicured, nothing that had ever belonged to the version of herself who tolerated dimming to make someone else shine. "Drive," she said softly. "Just drive." The city slid past. Towers flickered, highways bent like silver ribbons, and traffic lights blinked in patterns that almost felt like coded messages sent from the life she once lived. She watched strangers crossing sidewalks, couples, night workers, dreamers who hadn't yet been betrayed. She wondered whether betrayal was something every woman eventually encounters, or if she had simply ignored the warnings for too long. By the time the car stopped, she found herself in front of a modest, historic hotel nestled between glass giants. Its brick facade had weathered decades without apology. No paparazzi camped outside. No board members frequented the bar. No one inside would know her net worth or her husband's last name. And that anonymity felt like oxygen. Inside the lobby, an elderly concierge greeted her with a warm, uncalculated smile. "Evening, miss." "Long night." "Long life," she murmured. He chuckled without pressing further, a kindness rarer than diamonds in a world where people always want to know more. He handed her a key, the old-fashioned brass kind that felt like it opened possibilities, not rooms. The suite was simple, white sheets, soft lighting, windows overlooking a quieter part of the skyline, but to her it felt like liberation. She set her suitcase down and sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her knees. Only now did the weight of the day settle on her shoulders, like an unworn coat finally allowed to slip off. She inhaled deeply. The air here had no memory of Julian, no echoes of his rehearsed charm, no shadows shaped like disappointment. Her phone buzzed. Not with apologies. Julian wasn't brave enough to offer those yet. Not with threats. His lawyers hadn't caught up to the truth. Not with panic from the board. They didn't know the Empire's center had quietly relocated. It was a single message from the head of one of her Singapore operations. A woman she trusted. A woman who owed Elena nothing except respect earned over years of quiet collaboration. "Your transition protocols have been executed. If you need anything at all, we stand with you." Elena read it twice. There are moments when a person discovers the true measure of their life, not in the partners who betrayed them, but in the people who rise when everything else falls. It steadied her. Across the city, Julian sat in the penthouse she once made a home, surrounded by empty rooms that felt too large for his regrets. His calls had gone unanswered. His access denied. Lawyers scrambling. Investors suddenly uneasy. His kingdom, which he thought he controlled, was revealing the truth. He had been living in a house built on her intelligence, not his ambition. But Elena didn't think of him now. Not because she hated him, but because she finally understood. You don't heal by examining the wound. You heal by feeding the parts of you that survived it. She rose and walked to the window. The city didn't look threatening anymore. It looked calm, not by force but by clarity. She touched her reflection in the glass, tracing the outline of her own face. For years she had been a strategist hiding behind a title. Now she was a woman stepping into the fullness of her own design. Her fortune was safe. Her autonomy restored. Her future finally belonged to her. That realization washed over her with a warmth no marriage, no betrayal, no loss could extinguish. She felt it in her bones. This was not the end of something. It was the beginning of everything she had once been too patient to claim. As she stood there, a quiet thought wrapped itself around her like silk. He planned to leave me with nothing, but what he left was the one thing I needed most, myself. And for the first time in years she let herself smile. Not politely, not diplomatically, but deeply. The kind of smile that marks the moment a woman steps fully into her own story. The night outside glowed, and she glowed with it. The city seemed to bow slightly, recognizing not her wealth, but her return. Elena Stoneheart had left nothing behind. She had simply shed a life too small for her greatness. The night wrapped around her like an old, familiar coat as Elena stood by the window of the hotel suite. Outside, the city glimmered with 1,000 tiny truths, billboards, street lamps, the distant pulse of late-night traffic. All of it moved with a rhythm she recognized. A rhythm she had once lived inside without ever realizing she was carrying it. Tonight, for the first time in years, she was alone. Not lonely, just alone. And there is a difference, one she had forgotten until silence finally belonged to her again. She slipped off her heels and let her bare feet sink into the plush carpet. The sensation startled her. When was the last time she had walked barefoot in a room that didn't feel like a stage? When was the last time she had allowed herself softness not tied to expectation? She couldn't remember. Marriage had a way of turning simple things into luxuries, and luxuries into invisible debts. The night outside deepened. Neon lights flickered in the distance like slow-twitching nerves. Somewhere down below, a siren wailed, a sound she had long associated with trouble. But tonight it felt like a morning song for a version of herself she'd finally buried. She poured herself a glass of water and sat on the edge of the bed. Her body felt heavy, not from sorrow but from release. Leaving a life, even a broken one, requires strength that cannot be faked. The quiet pressed gently against her, encouraging her to breathe in a rhythm she didn't recognize at first. Her phone vibrated. For a moment she considered ignoring it. She had spent years answering calls at inconvenient hours, clients, brokers, boards, lawyers, her husband pretending urgency when what he really wanted was control. Tonight the device felt like an intruder. But the vibration persisted, steady and patient. She picked it up. A text message appeared on the screen, glowing in the dimness. "Elena, please. Can we talk? Julian." She let the phone fall onto the comforter. Not angrily, just tiredly. Like a book she no longer needed to finish because she already knew the ending. He didn't understand yet. Men like Julian rarely did until the paper cuts of consequence finally bled enough to stain their tailored suits. Her eyes closed. Memories drifted in. Uninvited but faithful, she saw herself at 24, sitting in their cramped starter apartment, typing late into the night while Julian slept. Back when his ambition still smelled like hope instead of hunger. Back when they dreamed together, spoke of futures woven from equal threads. Back when he would look at her like she was the reason gravity worked. She opened her eyes again. Those years were gone, and she no longer owed them resurrection. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The plaster was old with the kind of imperfections she found comforting, evidence of a structure that had survived seasons without pretending to be flawless. Her breath steadied, but a thought tugged at her quietly, a whisper at the edge of clarity. What now? She was free, yes. Safe, yes. But escape is not the same as arrival. Leaving Julian did not answer the larger question. What would her life become without the scaffolding of marriage around it? She sat up, reached for her laptop on the bedside table, and opened it. Not to manage assets or review markets. Tonight she wanted to see her life not as numbers but as a map. A map she could finally redraw. The screen illuminated her face as she opened the encrypted vault containing all her holdings. Line after line of subsidiaries, trusts, properties, partnerships glowed quietly, each one a story she had written while Julian bragged about being the main character. For years she had organized these assets logically, strategically, dutifully. Now she examined them emotionally, as a woman choosing her future, not as a wife protecting a past. She clicked through the logistics software platform. It was her masterpiece. She remembered the night she built the predictive model that outperformed the market by 11%. When she brought it to Julian excited, he had kissed her cheek and said, "Brilliant. Let's present it to investors together." Then in the boardroom, he took the lead while she stood beside him like a decorative footnote. That memory no longer stung. It only clarified. Next, she opened the files for the Caraway Maritime Trust, the one her grandfather started with 2 ships and a stubborn belief in honest work. Now it held contracts with 6 major ports and owned stakes in nearly 400 vessels worldwide. She traced the numbers with her fingertips, imagining her grandfather's pride. The last document she opened was a letter. A digital copy she kept encrypted for years. It was from her mother. Short. Tender. A note sent during the early days of her marriage. My beautiful girl, remember this. The world may celebrate loud men, but it is always built by quiet women. Do not shrink. Even for love. She closed the laptop slowly. Her mother had known. The clock struck midnight. Elena stood again, restless yet awakened. She walked to the window and drew the curtains fully open. The city was alive. A living, breathing entity moving without apology, purposeful in its imperfection. She placed her palm against the cool glass. The reflection staring back at her was familiar but newly claimed. The sharp cheekbones softened by exhaustion. The eyes holding the glow of someone who had survived a storm without letting it carve her hollow. The lips pressed together with quiet resolve. For a moment, she saw her younger self standing beside her reflection. Bright-eyed, hopeful, unaware of the battles ahead. She smiled at that girl gently, almost maternally. You did well, she whispered softly. But now let me take it from here. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. Elena, please. I didn't know it would go this far. She ignored it. She wasn't angry. Anger implies attachment. What she felt now was clarity, and clarity is colder and kinder than rage will ever be. Another message. We can fix this. She exhaled. Men like Julian always thought love was a machine, broken parts replaced, faulty pieces reassembled. But she wasn't machinery. She was architecture. And architecture doesn't repair itself for the comfort of those who weakened its foundation. A final message. Come home. She almost laughed. Home. As if the penthouse had been anything more than a well-decorated mausoleum for a life that had already died. She placed the phone face down and walked into the bathroom. The mirror reflected her as she turned on the tap. A hiss of water filled the room. She let her hands rest under the warmth, feeling her body soften, stretch awake in ways it had forgotten. She washed her face slowly, deliberately, as if cleansing the years themselves. Droplets pooled along her jawline before falling into the sink like tiny departures. When she finally wrapped herself in a robe and returned to the bed, her limbs hummed with a strange mix of exhaustion and renewal. She settled into the covers and allowed sleep to sway her like a lullaby carried by courage. But the night was not done speaking. Just as she drifted toward unconsciousness, she felt something inside her shift, an idea, subtle but insistent. It wasn't about Julian or revenge or empire. It was about purpose. Not the purpose defined by wealth, but the purpose born from surviving a life that demanded constant explanation. She sat up again. There were women like her, brilliant, underestimated, quiet architects of their own worlds, who had no idea they were allowed to choose themselves. Women trapped in marriages that felt like polite cages. Women who believed strategy belonged only to men. Women who needed to see someone walk out and walk upward at the same time. Elena inhaled. Her empire wasn't just money. It was influence. It was blueprint. It was possibility. For the first time in years, she felt something stir in her chest that wasn't grief or survival or obligation. It was ambition. Not the ambition that had fueled Julian. The ambition that saves rather than consumes. The ambition that builds bridges rather than trophies. The ambition that creates a life instead of controlling it. She whispered into the quiet room, "It's time." Outside, a gust of wind pressed against the building, carrying the scent of future rain. The city shifted. The night exhaled. And Elena Caraway Stoneheart, finally fully, began becoming the woman she had always been destined to be. This time her empire wouldn't be built behind anyone. It would be built in her own name. And no one, not a husband, not a lawyer, not a single man who underestimated her, would ever take it from her again. Morning didn't so much arrive as reveal itself slowly, filtering through the thin curtains of the hotel room in pale, uncertain stripes. Elena woke before the alarm, before the city fully remembered it had somewhere to be. For a moment, in that soft blur between dream and memory, she forgot which bed she was in, which life she was wearing. Then the previous day returned to her, not as a blow but as a sequence. Papers, clauses, a kitchen, a man shrinking into the truth he'd written for himself, a suitcase placed on a chair, not as an escape, but as a decision finally allowed to stand. She lay still listening. No distant hiss of the espresso machine she never used but Julian insisted they must have. No muffled chatter of the financial news channel he kept on like a heartbeat. No footsteps of staff rehearsing invisibility. Just the hum of the hotel's old pipes and the faint buzz of air conditioning trying its best. Freedom, she realized, doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it just sounds like a quieter room. She sat up and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet met the floor, cool and steady. On the nightstand, her phone lay face down. A small black rectangle holding the world she had momentarily stepped outside of. She turned it over. Overnight, a river of messages had gathered. Missed calls from Julian, terse notifications from their general counsel, 2 politely urgent emails from board members who never addressed her directly until now. She opened the lawyer's message first. Miss Stoneheart, we've been informed of substantial structural changes to the Caraway and Associated Trusts. Mr. Stone has requested an emergency meeting. In light of these developments, I strongly advise you obtain independent counsel. Today. Independent counsel. The phrase made her smile faintly. For 20 years, she had been structurally dependent in a system she architected herself. Men in suits billed by the hour, explaining things she already understood in more detail than they ever would. Today that ended too. She showered dressed simply, dark trousers, a white shirt, a blazer with pockets deep enough to carry things that mattered. No statement jewelry. No curated designer moment. Her power didn't need ornament now, it had finally come home. Downstairs, the hotel's small cafe smelled of coffee and toasted bread. A few guests hunched over laptops, faces illuminated by deadlines. The barista greeted her with a nod that contained no recognition of who she was, and she found herself grateful. She ordered tea, nothing more, and sat by the window with a legal pad she borrowed from the front desk. She clicked a pen and drew a line down the center of the page. On the left she wrote what he tried to take. On the right she wrote what I refused to give. Under the first she listed it bleakly: money, ownership, narrative, dignity. Under the second the list grew slower, steadier: self-respect, gentleness, purpose, the ability to look in the mirror without wincing. Then at the bottom of the right column, she added one more word: mercy. Not for him. Not yet. For herself. She folded the page and slipped it into her blazer. Then and only then, did she search her contacts for a name she hadn't dialed in years. When the number rang, a warm, familiar voice answered. Elena? This is unexpected. Good morning, David, she said. I need a lawyer who remembers I have a brain. Are you still that man? There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. I'd like to think so. Tell me where you are. I'll clear my morning. 2 hours later, she sat across from him in a corner office that looked nothing like Julian's world. No art chosen to signal a portfolio. Just shelves of well-used books, a plant that looked like it had been rescued rather than bought, and windows that opened onto the street instead of the clouds. David Caldwell had been her family's attorney when her grandfather was still alive. He'd handled the logistics of modest wills, small land disputes, contracts drawn up with handshakes already half-finished. She remembered him from childhood as the man who listened. While other adults talked over her, he had once told her, if you understand the numbers, you understand the story. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. He looked older now. Gray threaded his hair, lines folded gently around his mouth. But his eyes were the same, clear, curious, alive. He listened as she spoke. She told him everything, not with drama but with detail. The stone church, the spreadsheets, the trusts, the divorce papers found on a Tuesday. The quiet midnight shift of an empire that had always worn her fingerprints. When she finished, he stayed silent for a moment, his hand steepled in front of his lips. Elena, he said finally, legally you're protected. Financially, you're more than protected. But that's not what you're asking me about. She met his gaze. No. You're asking what comes next that won't turn you into the kind of person you've spent your life refusing to be. She nodded once. He leaned back. You have every legal right to bury him, he said bluntly. To strip him of position, power, maybe even reputation. No court will look at the paper trail and side with a man who tried to rewrite history in his favor and got outmaneuvered by the author. She exhaled. I know. Do you want that? He asked. Not as a trap. As a genuine question. She looked out the window. Down below, a woman shepherded 2 children across the street. One child dragged a backpack twice its size. The other jumped over cracks like they were lava. Their mother held both their hands, anchored and patient. "I want the truth to stand," Elena said slowly. "I want what's mine to stay mine. I want him to understand that I was never standing behind him. I was standing under him, holding the floor. But I don't want my future to be an altar to his collapse." David nodded. "Then we craft terms that reflect that." He pulled a legal pad toward himself. "We dissolve the marriage cleanly. No public spectacle. You retain full control of your premarital and careaway assets. We acknowledge your sole ownership of the logistics suite and associated IP. He gets." "Enough," she interjected. "Not everything. Not nothing. Enough. Enough to live," she said. "But not to pretend he built what he didn't." "Alimony." "No," she replied. "I don't pay men to leave. I already paid the price staying as long as I did." He almost smiled. "And his role in the company?" She thought about it. About the board, the investors, the media that loved a sharp jaw and a practiced soundbite. "He can stay as an employee if the board wants him," she said. "But he doesn't get to captain a ship whose maps he never drew. No more CEO title. No more unilateral signing powers." "That will gut him more than taking his money," David remarked quietly. "I know," she replied. "But this isn't about punishment. It's about proportion." He jotted notes, the pen scratching softly. "We'll need to meet his counsel," he said. "May I reach out?" "Yes," she said. "But there's something I need to do first." "What's that?" She looked at him, and for a moment, the girl who once sat in his office swinging her legs over a too-high chair resurfaced. "I need to go back to the beginning," she said. "To remember who I was before I started making myself smaller to fit inside his story." He regarded her with something like, he said, "We'll handle the paper while you handle the person." When she left the office, the day had grown brighter. The air was sharp with the kind of cold that makes breath visible, as if the body insists on broadcasting proof of existence. She didn't go back to the hotel. She didn't go to any of the properties she owned in neighborhoods that smelled like curated candles and old money. Instead, she drove to the train station and bought a ticket without thinking twice. The coastal town where her mother died was a quiet bruise on the map. The train ride took a little over 2 hours, enough time for the city to loosen its grip and the landscape to grow softer. Glass gave way to brick. Brick to clapboard. Towers to trees. She arrived in the late afternoon, when the light had begun to slant, turning everything it touched into a brief, golden confession. The air smelled like salt and pine and something else, something like relief. The house was as she remembered it, small, stubborn, its white paint peeling in places but standing. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust motes turned in the shaft of light that cut through the living room. The old sofa sagged in the middle like it always had. Her mother's books still leaned against each other on sagging shelves. Home, she realized, was not the penthouse view of a river she'd watched without ever touching. Home was this, rooms that knew her as a child before they knew her as an asset. She walked through each space slowly, fingers brushing the back of chairs, tracing the grooves in the dining table where her grandfather had once hammered a nail without using a proper bench. She stopped in the small room that had been hers as a girl. The bed was still there, the quilts faded but intact. On the wall, a few yellowed pages from mathematics magazine she'd once torn out, proud of problems she'd solved faster than the printed solution. On the desk, a shoebox waited, its lid slightly askew. She opened it. Inside, bundles of letters lay tied with twine. Some were addressed to her grandfather in careful looping script. Some to her mother. At the bottom, one envelope sat alone, her own name written in her mother's familiar hand. Her throat tightened as she opened it. "My Elena, if you're reading this, life has brought you back to a place where you can hear me again. I won't pretend to know what roads you've walked, but I know the gravity in your bones. You were born to hold more than people thought you could. You were also born with a softness some will mistake for weakness. Let them. Softness is not the opposite of strength. It is what keeps strength from turning cruel. If you ever find yourself in a life where you have wealth but no room to breathe, remember, you come from people who built without applause. We did not raise you to live under someone else's idea of your size. Love, Mom." Elena sat down on the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in her hand. We did not raise you to live under someone else's idea of your size. She had shrunk for so long, she almost forgot she'd ever been vast. Tears came, not dramatic, not shaking, just steady like a long overdue rain. They traced down her cheeks and fell onto the old wooden floor, disappearing into its grain. The house held her quietly, unafraid of her grief. She didn't cry for Julian, or for the marriage, or even for the fortune he had tried to steal. She cried for the years she spent turning down the volume on herself, so he wouldn't feel threatened in rooms she had unlocked. When the tears finally slowed, she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the shoebox. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She lay on the small bed, curled on her side, and let herself fall into an afternoon sleep without an alarm or an agenda. When she woke, the sun had set. The room glowed with the soft blue of early evening. Her phone buzzed on the dresser, insistent. She checked the screen. This time it wasn't Julian. It was David. He's agreed to a meeting. Tomorrow, his counsel me. You. She stared at the message for a long moment. There would have to be one more room. One more table. One more conversation with the man who had planned to carve her out of the life she'd built. Fine, she texted back. I'll be there. She slept at the house that night, under blankets that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. No nightmares visited. The worst had already knocked. She had already opened the door and walked past it. Morning found her different. Not lighter exactly, but aligned. When she returned to the city, the meeting had already begun assembling itself without her. Board members whispering. Lawyers stacking files like shields. Julian pacing in a conference room surrounded by glass, his reflection watching him from 13 different angles. He had aged in 72 hours. Not in years but in posture. Certain types of fear bend the spine. He looked up when she entered. For a moment, the room went quiet in the way forests do when something rare steps into view. She wasn't wearing power in the way they recognized. No sharp-shouldered designer suit. No necklace worth a mid-level salary. Just that blazer, that calm, that gaze that now looked like it had stopped asking permission to exist. She sat at the table without being invited. David took the chair beside her. Opposite them, Julian's attorney, a slick man with expensive cufflinks and a perpetual half-smile, cleared his throat. Mrs. Stoneheart. Elena, she corrected. We won't be using that name much longer. He adjusted. Elena. We're here to see if we can reach an amicable settlement. She folded her hands, letting the silence thicken just enough. There's nothing amicable about planning a divorce behind someone's back, she said, not angrily, just accurately. But there can be clarity. And closure. That will have to be enough. Julian watched her as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps he finally was. Document across the table. This is our revised proposal, he said. Given the recent asset restructuring, my client is willing to concede primary control of Caraway and related holdings in exchange for. David didn't touch the document. No, he said simply. The lawyer blinked. You haven't read it. We don't need to, David replied. We're not here to entertain revised versions of a future she has already secured. Julian's jaw tensed. Then what are you here for? He snapped. Elena turned to him, and for a moment, the room shrank to just the two of them. We're here, she said softly, to settle the part of this you still think you can control. She slid a different document onto the table. Her document. Drafted on David's letterhead, but written in the cadence of her mind. These are my terms, she said. The lawyer picked it up, eyes scanning. As he read, his posture changed, first incredulous, then calculating, then grudgingly impressed. Julian broke first. What does it say? The lawyer hesitated, then summarized. She retains full ownership and controlling interest of all Caraway assets and the logistics network. You relinquish any claim to them, present or future. The marital properties are divided proportionally. You keep the Aspen house and the Paris apartment. She keeps the penthouse and the coastal properties. Liquid assets are generous in your favor, all things considered. Julian frowned. That sounds fair. The word seemed to confuse him. That's not all, the lawyer continued. You step down as CEO. Effective immediately. You may remain as an advisor, at the board's discretion, with a defined salary and no unilateral authority. There's a mutual non-disparagement clause. No media theatrics. No telling the world any version of this that contradicts the paper trail. He looked up. And you legal action against each other, once this is executed. Julian stared at her. You're letting me stay? He asked, disbelieving. After all of this? She held his gaze. Stay? Yes. Rule? No. He swallowed. Why? He whispered. The room waited. Even the HVAC seemed to hush. Because, she said slowly, I refuse to spend the rest of my life orbiting around what you did. Destroying you might satisfy something ugly for a moment. But I want more than a moment. I want a life. He sat back, the fight slowly draining from his shoulders. You could have taken everything, he said. She shook her head. I already have everything I need. His eyes filled with something complicated. Regret, perhaps, or the nauseating realization that he had gambled badly with something priceless. I thought you wouldn't notice, he admitted quietly, more to himself than to the room. I thought you loved me too much to do this. She softened, not toward him, but toward the version of herself who once believed loving someone meant making herself endlessly available for their worst impulses. I did love you, she said. Deeply. Enough to build an empire under your name because I thought we were the same story. Her voice stayed gentle. But loving you was never the same as abandoning myself. You just counted on me not knowing the difference. No one spoke. David slid a pen across the table. It came to rest in the space between them like a tiny, weighty verdict. Sign, he said quietly. Not as command but as invitation. Julian picked up the pen. His hand shook. He signed. The lawyer signed. David signed. Finally, Elena took the pen, her fingers steady, and added her name to the end of a chapter that had gone on longer than it should have. With each stroke of ink, she felt a tether loosen from her ribs. When it was done, the documents were gathered, clipped, placed neatly in. No fanfare. Just the sound of paper sliding into a briefcase and a future rearranging itself. As they stood to leave, Julian reached for her. Elena. She stepped back just enough. Take the life you have left and do something honest with it, she said quietly. That will be the only apology that ever matters. He nodded, eyes bright, words lost. She walked out of the conference room with David beside her. The hallway seemed longer than when she'd entered, but lighter. Staff glanced up as she passed, some with curiosity, some with recognition, some with that subtle, quiet awe reserved for people who have just walked through fire without smelling of smoke. At the elevator bank, David turned to her. Are you all right? He asked. She thought about it. All right was too small. All right was what you told people when you were still holding your breath, hoping nothing worse would happen. I'm alive, she said. Then she added, and I'm done making myself smaller to keep other people comfortable. He smiled. Then I'd say you're more than all right. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. The doors closed on the old life, and when they opened again on the ground floor, Elena stepped into the street as a woman who no longer had to measure herself against any man's imagination. There would be headlines eventually. Whispers. Versions of the story traded over charity galas and boardroom lunches. Did you hear? The Stonehearts divorced. I heard she gutted him. I heard he cheated. I heard she was always the real genius. Let them talk, she thought. She knew the truth. She had the papers to prove it, yes. But more importantly, she had the quiet knowledge that she had not become cruel to escape cruelty. She had drawn a line, not a sword. As she walked down the street, past coffee shops and dog walkers and people arguing over ordinary things, she felt something inside her expand to fill the space her fear used to occupy. The empire was still hers. Money was still hers. The power was still hers. But more importantly, the woman behind all of it had finally come into full view. And this time, she wasn't hiding behind anyone's last name. There is a strange clarity that arrives once a storm has passed, not the triumphant kind that shouts victory, but the quieter illumination that shows you what survived the rain. As Elena walked away from the building where her marriage had legally dissolved, she felt that clarity settle over her like a second skin. It wasn't joy. It wasn't sorrow. It was something far more powerful, orientation. She knew where she was, and perhaps for the first time in years she knew where she was heading. The city hummed around her, purposeful and indifferent. People hurried to meetings, couples argued softly at crosswalks, Cyclists weaved through lanes with the determination of those who believe time can be outrun. And yet, through the noise and bustle, Elena moved with a different tempo. Steady, unhurried, anchored by an interior compass that no longer spun in response to someone else's gravity. She turned a corner and found herself in a quieter part of the district, where cafes spilled warm light onto sidewalks and bookstores leaned against each other like old friends. Her steps slowed in front of one particular shop, its window crowded with novels whose spines held entire lives inside them. She pushed open the door, and a bell chimed above her head, a soft, nostalgic sound that inexplicably made her throat tighten. Inside, the store smelled of aged paper, ink and dust, scents so familiar they felt like whispers from her childhood. Shelves towered around her, filled with stories of people who had clawed their way through loss, found new beginnings, rebuilt themselves from brokenness. She ran her fingers lightly along the spines, feeling the texture of resilience pressed into each page. "You're back," a voice said gently. She turned. A woman with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood behind the counter, her expression warm with recognition. Mrs. Alden, former professor, owner of the bookstore, and one of the few adults who had ever spoken to young Elena as though her thoughts had weight. "I didn't think you'd remember me," Elena said softly. Mrs. Alden smiled. "Some people pass through this world making no impression at all. You were not one of them." The words landed with a surprising heaviness. Elena crossed the shop and leaned against the counter, suddenly grateful for the presence of someone who had known her before her name became attached to headlines and valuations. "I need grounding," Elena admitted. "A reminder of who I was before I became someone else's idea of success." Mrs. Alden nodded. "Ah, then you came to the right place. Books remember us even when we forget ourselves." She walked around the counter and gestured for Elena to follow. Together they wandered through narrow aisles until they reached a small alcove where sunlight filtered through a stained glass window, bathing the shelves in amber tones. "Here," Mrs. Alden said, pulling out a slim volume with a faded cover. "You gave a presentation on this book when you were 17. Do you remember?" Elena took it. The Essays of Marina Keene, a collection of reflections on solitude, courage, and the reclamation of self. Her mother had loved this author. Elena had devoured the book the summer before university. "I remember," she whispered. "You argue that courage isn't loud," Mrs. Alden said. "It's patient. It's choosing to stand even when the world insists you kneel." Elena's breath hitched. The words felt too close, too true. "You were brave then," Mrs. Alden continued. "You're braver now." Elena closed the book and pressed it lightly to her chest. "I feel untethered," she said. "Free, yes, but also uncontained." Mrs. Alden chuckled softly. "Uncontained is what your life needed to be." A long silence stretched between them, quiet but full. Then Elena spoke again, her voice steadier. "I'm going to build something new," she said. "Not another company. Not another empire. Something meaningful." Mrs. Alden's eyes warmed. "Then build the thing you needed most. We always know the answer, we just rarely allow ourselves to speak it." Elena nodded, tears prickling at the edges of her vision. She thanked the woman, purchased the book, and stepped back out into the afternoon light with her chest tingling, not from pain but from possibility. She made her way down the street, her mind unspooling quietly. Each step felt like a thread weaving into a tapestry that no longer included Julian's shadow. She thought of women in boardrooms whose ideas were dismissed until echoed by men. She thought of women at kitchen tables balancing budgets, raising children, managing households with the precision of CFOs without any of the recognition. She thought of herself, walking barefoot in hotel rooms, whispering apologies to the girl she had once been for letting herself be dimmed. And then, like a lantern being lit inside her, an idea formed. Not a business strategy, not a profitable venture. Purpose. Her mind began shaping it slowly, then all at once. A foundation. But not the kind people build to polish reputations. A consortium. A sanctuary. A network of women supporting women. Not in charity but in power. Teaching them what Elena had taught herself in silence. How to move money. How to protect assets. How to build futures that couldn't be erased by anyone's signature but their own. A place that whispered, "You are not small. You never were." The idea swelled inside her, filling spaces she hadn't realized were hollow. She quickened her pace, her mind alive with detail, locations, funding, outreach, legal structures, partnerships, mentorships. The blueprint grew, expanding beyond her chest form with every block she walked. She didn't notice the time until she reached the river. The water shimmered beneath the lowering sun, carrying with it the soft gold of daylight surrendering to dusk. She stood at the railing, wind brushing her hair, and felt something shift, a quiet click inside her, like a lock turning after years of resistance. This was her moment. This stretch of river, this city, this surge of clarity, she would remember it forever as the place where the next chapter announced itself. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't hesitate. It was a message from a journalist she respected, one who told stories with dignity, not spectacle. I heard about the restructuring. If you ever want to share your side off the record, my door is open. Elena typed slowly. One day, she replied. Not yet. I'm building something. The reply came quickly. Then I look forward to that chapter. She put her phone away and leaned against the railing, watching the water drift toward tomorrow. She imagined the foundation's launch, the women who would walk through its doors, the stories they would no longer be afraid to write, the daughters who would grow up seeing their mothers as architects, not assistants. For the first time since she had discovered the divorce papers on that Tuesday afternoon, Elena felt not just free, but powerful in a way that didn't require domination or secrecy. Power that felt earned. Power that felt rightful. A power she no longer had to translate for anyone. She stayed by the river until the last streak of light faded. When she finally turned to leave, her steps were no longer just steady, they were certain. Tomorrow she would choose a name for the foundation. Tomorrow she would call the first woman she wanted by her side. Tomorrow she would begin shifting not just her own empire, but the landscape where countless women had been quietly building theirs. But tonight, she walked toward the train station with a softness she hadn't felt in years. A softness that wasn't weakness. A softness that was strength unmasked. A softness earned. And as she moved through the darkening streets, her heart whispered a truth she had tried too long to ignore. She had not lost a husband. She had reclaimed a life. The next morning came with a sky washed pale, as though dawn had taken a soft cloth to the world and wiped away the harshness of the night before. The air felt clearer somehow, cool, crisp, honest. Elena stepped out of her townhouse, the one she'd chosen deliberately after leaving the penthouse. It wasn't large, wasn't showy, but it was chosen. Chosen by her. And that distinction changed everything about how it felt beneath her feet. She walked down the stone steps with the calm certainty of someone who no longer questioned her place in the world. Today wasn't the beginning of anything new. It was the continuation of who she had always been, now without the weight of compromise strapped to her back. The world hadn't changed, but she had. And that difference carried its own gravity. She made her way toward a cafe a few blocks down, a small space tucked between a florist and a music shop. The smell of roasted beans drifted into the street, mingling with the faint sweetness of the flower shop's open door. She stepped inside and ordered a tea, her voice soft but grounded. People around her talked in low hums, students bent over laptops, a man reading a newspaper, a mother bouncing a toddler on her knee. Ordinary people in ordinary moments. It struck her gently how foreign this normalcy had become. She hadn't been part of day-to-day life in years. She had been orbiting a world built on high-stakes decisions and closed-door negotiations. But here no one looked twice at her. No one whispered her name or her net worth or the scandal unraveling in Julian's world. In here, she was simply a woman waiting for her tea. And the anonymity felt like an embrace. She took her drink to a small table near the window and opened her notebook. Its pages were blank except for one line at the top of the first page. Something she'd written the night before. Teach her what she never learned to ask. Her pen hovered over the next page. Then it moved not by planning but by instinct. Words poured out, not in lists or charts or strategy trees, but in the kind of rhythm that comes when truth stops asking for permission to speak. Women are taught how to survive, but rarely how to protect themselves from the people they love. They are taught how to nurture, but rarely how to negotiate their worth. They are taught how to build homes, but rarely how to build exits. She paused. The foundation wasn't about charity. It was about knowledge. It was about equipping women with the tools she had spent years learning alone, in the shadows of boardrooms filled with voices louder but not wiser than hers. She wrote the core of it there on the page. Teach her what power sounds like when she speaks her own language. She closed her eyes and let the idea settle into her bones. A sanctuary for women who had brilliance but no blueprint. Not a refuge from men, but a classroom where they learn to structure, to strategize, to shield, to grow, to rise. The pen tapped softly against the page. The door of the cafe opened, a small bell chiming. Elena lifted her gaze just as a familiar figure entered, Clara, the COO of a European logistics firm that Elena had quietly saved from collapse 8 years ago. Clara had flown in at the request of the board when restructuring rumors began circulating, but Elena had left the city before Clara arrived. They hadn't spoken since. Clara spotted her instantly. "Elena," she said, surprise mixed with relief. "I've been looking for you." Elena smiled gently. "You always did find me where the good tea is." Clara approached the table, pulling off her scarf. "Is it true?" she asked, lowering her voice. "Everything happening with Julian?" Elena nodded once. Clara exhaled, her face softening with sympathy. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "You didn't deserve that." Elena stirred her tea. Deserving doesn't shape what people do. Character does. Clara pulled out the chair across from her. "The board is supportive of you," she said. "They know who built the network. They know who held the reins." Elena's gaze dropped to her notebook. "I'm not returning as CEO." Clara didn't argue. Instead, she waited. "I'm building something else," Elena said after a moment. "Something better." Clara sat back. "Will you tell me?" Elena pushed the notebook toward her. Clara read the lines, her expression shifting from curiosity to awe. "This is," Clara whispered. "Elena, this could change lives." "That's the point." Clara closed the notebook and slid it back. "Whatever you need," she said. "I'm in." Elena smiled, not with surprise, but with the recognition that for the first time, she wasn't moving in secrecy. She wasn't building behind anyone. She was standing at the center of her own design, and people were choosing to join her, not out of obligation but alignment. They spent the next hour discussing structure, programs, potential partnerships. Elena spoke with a fluidity she hadn't felt in years. Every idea built on another like bricks placed with deliberate hands. As she described her vision, she felt something expand in her chest. Not ambition, not pride, but a kind of gentle fire that burned without consuming. When they parted, Clara hugged her tightly. "You're doing something revolutionary," she said. "And you're doing it quietly. That's the best kind." Elena watched her leave, then stepped outside herself. The sky had darkened into a deepening gray, and a soft drizzle began to fall. She pulled her coat tighter around her and walked, letting the cool drops sprinkle across her face. The rain didn't bother her. It felt cleansing, like the city was washing away alone for too long. She walked to the river again. Water always steadied her. Today it felt like an invitation. She stood at the railing, her breath visible in the cool air, and let her mind wander. A foundation. A movement. A place where women learn not just to survive but to strategize. A network that would outlive her. A legacy built not on secrecy but on empowerment. She imagined the first workshop, a room filled with women who had spent years apologizing for their brilliance. She imagined telling them, "You don't have to ask for permission to save yourself. You get to write the fine print of your own life. You get to be the architect, not the artifact." And slowly, she felt the truth resonate inside her. She wasn't rebuilding her life. She was building the life she should have had from the beginning. As the wind picked up, her hair lifted from her shoulders and she closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could already see the future forming, steady, luminous, undeniable. A future where she didn't have to shrink. A future where she didn't have to fight to be seen. A future where she no longer carried the weight of someone else's fear. A future written in her own handwriting. Elena opened her eyes again, the river stretching endlessly before her. The city lights reflected on the water like scattered stars. She let her hands rest on the cold railing, grounding herself in the moment. Tomorrow she would meet with her first team. Tomorrow she would choose a location. Tomorrow she would start building. But tonight, she allowed herself one quiet truth. She was no longer escaping a man. She was stepping into herself. And in that step, Measured, deliberate, unhurried, Elena Stoneheart became more powerful than she had ever allowed herself to be. The first boardroom of Elena's new life wasn't in a skyscraper. It wasn't surrounded by glass walls or overlooking a skyline. It was a converted warehouse on the south side of the city, a place that once stored industrial parts and now carried the scent of freshly painted walls and the faint metallic echo of possibility. When she pushed the heavy door open, the light humming through the tall windows fell across her like a quiet spotlight announcing the next chapter. Inside, a long wooden table stood at the center, handmade, uneven, beautiful in its imperfection. 6 women sat around it. Not by design but by gravity. Women who had been drawn to her vision, each carrying her own story, her own scars, her own hidden architecture. Clara sat nearest to her, fingers wrapped around a mug of tea. Across from her, a tech strategist who had built 3 companies but lost 2 of them to predatory partnerships. A former family attorney who had seen too many women walk into her office only after losing everything. A venture capitalist who had resigned from her firm after her male partners repeatedly funded the men she mentored while dismissing her instincts. 2 more women sat quietly, one a financial analyst, the other a sociologist who specialized in patterns of generational empowerment. They all stood when Elena entered. "No need for that," she said, lifting a hand gently. "Sit, please. This isn't a place of performance. It's a place of building." She took a seat, and the room seemed to exhale, aligning itself around her calm. "Welcome," she began. "And thank you for coming before anything even exists. That means more than you know." Clara leaned forward. "Tell them what you told me," she urged softly. Elena nodded and opened her notebook, not because she needed to read from it, but because she wanted to show the beginning. The first line she had written days earlier. The truth of it had grown roots inside her. "This," she said, tapping the page, "is our purpose. Teach her what she never learned to ask." The women listened. Some nodded. Some blinked back emotion. All understood. She continued. "For too long, women have been taught to survive their circumstances, not redesign them. They've been taught to be grateful, not strategic. They've been taught to share, but not to shield. They've been told to build families, not foundations. To trust love without understanding law. To compromise before they calculate." She paused, her gaze traveling across their faces. "I want to change that." A murmur rippled through the room, agreement, resonance, relief. "This will be a place where women learn what no one thinks they need to know until it's too late. Protecting assets, structuring businesses, understanding leverage, reading contracts, building exits, securing autonomy, and safeguarding futures." The attorney spoke first. "You're creating a quiet revolution." Elena shook her head gently. "Not a revolution. A correction." The tech founder leaned forward. "Do you want this to be local? National? Global?" "Global," Elena said without hesitation. "Women everywhere need access to knowledge, not after they lose something, but before they're ever challenged." The sociologist added. "Then we'll need to build a curriculum. Not classes, frameworks." "Yes," Elena said. "Frameworks that evolve. Each modular. Each adaptable. Each transferable." The venture capitalist tapped her pen lightly. "Funding won't be an issue. I can bring in 3 partners who'll back this with no strings." "No strings," Elena repeated, her voice firm. "That's the rule. Anyone who invests must understand that this isn't charity. It's infrastructure. And we don't build infrastructure for anyone who wants to own it." There was silence again, respectful silence. The financial analyst spoke next. "We'll need a name." Elena had been waiting for that question. She opened her notebook to a tab she'd marked with a small strip of ribbon. On clean, deliberate script. She slid the notebook into the center of the table. The women leaned in. The Caraway Foundation for Women's Intelligence. It wasn't just a name. It was a reclamation. It was a nod to her grandfather's legacy, a legacy built with honest hands. And it was a challenge to the world, to stop treating women's intelligence as an accessory. Clara's eyes softened. "It's perfect." The sociologist nodded. "It tells the truth before anyone even walks through the door." The attorney smiled. "It's the first name I've heard in years that feels like a promise." Elena breathed in slowly, letting the affirmation wash over her. "Then it's decided." They spent the next 4 hours mapping the skeleton of the foundation. The warehouse was cold, but the energy in the room was warm and alive. Ideas flowed without competition. Questions emerged without fear. Women spoke without raising their voices. No one interrupted. No one dismissed. No one stole credit. It felt like the opposite of every boardroom she had ever sat in beside Julian. By the end of the meeting, their papers were filled with arrows, notes, diagrams, and the kind of scribbles that only appear when brilliance stops apologizing for itself. As they packed up, Clara touched Elena's elbow gently. "You know," she said, "this is the first time I've ever seen you sit at the head of the table." Elena looked at the chair. It was a simple wooden seat, slightly taller than the others. An accident of furniture placement, nothing more. Still, her answer came quiet and sure. "It's the first time I've ever wanted to." Outside, the sky had begun to deepen into evening. The women left one by one, stepping into the twilight with new purpose shining in their eyes. Elena stayed behind, standing in the middle of the warehouse alone now, the echo of their voices still humming in the rafters. She looked at the empty table, at the rough brick walls waiting to be transformed, and she realized something. She had believed that walking away from Julian was the end of her marriage. But the truth was clearer now. Walking away from Julian was the beginning of her becoming. The warehouse door creaked open behind her. She turned. Julian stood there. He didn't enter. He didn't step over the threshold. He stood just outside the line between what she'd left and what she was building. His face was thinner, tired, but not angry. For the first time in years he looked human. "Elena," he said quietly. She didn't move toward him. She didn't flinch. She simply waited. "I'm not here to fight," he said, "or to undo anything. I just needed to see you. One last time." She lifted her chin slightly, not with pride but clarity. "Why?" He looked around the warehouse, at the table, at the notes, at the blueprint of a future he wasn't invited into. "I wanted to see where you went after you stopped holding me up." The words hung in the air. He continued. "I thought losing the company would break me. I thought losing the title would destroy me. But losing you," his voice cracked. "I didn't realize how small I'd made myself trying to be big next to you." Elena's breath softened. "I never asked you to be small," she said. "I know," he whispered. "That's the worst part. You never asked me to shrink or to lie or to pretend. You just kept rising. And instead of rising with you, I tried to pull you back." She didn't respond. He wasn't wrong. But she wasn't here to soothe him. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were rough, unpolished, unscripted. Not the kind of sorry that asks for forgiveness. Just the kind that tells the truth. She looked at him quietly. Then she said the words she had needed to say. Not for him but for herself. "We don't owe each other anything anymore." Julian nodded, quickly as though ashamed. "I hope," he began, then paused. "I hope the world sees what you're about to build. And I hope one day I can say I knew you before it existed." Elena stepped closer, not to embrace him, not to comfort him, but to acknowledge the humanity of the moment. "You did," she said softly. "But you didn't know me." He closed his eyes as the truth settled. Then slowly he stepped back from the warehouse door. "Goodbye, Elena." She nodded once. "Goodbye, Julian." He turned and walked into the night, his shadow stretching long behind him. She watched until he disappeared into the city. Then she closed the warehouse door, firmly, gently, on what was now only a past. Turning around, she stood in the center of the empty room again. The air felt cleaner. The space felt larger. The echoes felt like possibility. For the first time in her life, Elena Caraway Stoneheart felt something she had never dared to name before. She felt whole. Dawn broke differently the next morning, not as a faint suggestion, but as a declaration. Light spilled across the city in wide, confident strokes, brushing the buildings with gold as if the world itself understood something monumental had shifted. Elena stepped outside just as the sun lifted from the horizon, her breath visible in the crisp air, her body moving with the grounded certainty of a woman who had finally rearranged the architecture of her life. She walked toward the river, the place that had become her compass. Water always told the truth. It reflected what stood before it without distortion, without judgment, without trying to rewrite the story in its own favor. She leaned against the railing and watched the current sweep steadily toward the future, and in its push she felt her own forward motion. Today was the day. Contracts signed. Infrastructure drafted. Partners aligned. The warehouse would soon transform into a headquarters not for a business, but for a rising of quiet strength, women stepping into the rooms they once tiptoed around. The Caraway Foundation would launch with a gala later that season, but the first official meeting would take place this afternoon. And Elena wasn't just attending it. She was leading it. As she stood there, her phone buzzed with new messages. Investors confirming. Potential partners reaching out. A dozen women who had heard whispers about the new initiative asking how they could join, contribute, learn, grow. She smiled, not at the attention, but at the alignment. It felt like the world was finally catching up to a truth she kept folded inside her like a letter waiting for the right day to be opened. She replied to each message with care, her fingertips moving across the screen with a rhythm fueled by purpose rather than pressure. She didn't rush. Rushing belonged to the life she'd left behind. Today she moved with intention. As the morning unfolded, she made her way to the warehouse, her headquarters in progress. The building stood proud in its rawness, sunlight pouring through its tall windows like liquid gold. When she opened the door, she found workers already inside, measuring beams, inspecting wires, sketching plans. She could hear saws humming, metal clanging gently, voices discussing transitions and timelines. Clara arrived moments later, holding 2 coffees. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing one to her. "Thank you," Elena replied warmly. "How's everything coming along?" "Better than expected," Clara said. "People are excited. Contractors are ahead of schedule. The architect you approved is brilliant. She wants to keep the original beams exposed, make them a symbol of strength." "I like that," Elena said softly. "You're glowing," Clara added with a grin. "And before you roll your eyes, it's not metaphorical. You're actually glowing." Elena laughed, the sound light and free. "Must be the coffee." "It's not the coffee," Clara replied. "It's this. All of this. You're standing in the center of your purpose." Elena didn't answer directly. She simply looked around the warehouse, the future carved into brick and air, and felt a wave of belonging settle into her bones. The hours that followed were a rush of meetings, measurements, planning sessions, legal reviews, and strategy discussions. But none of it felt heavy. None of it felt like the silent burden she used to carry in Julian's shadow. Here, every conversation elevated her. Every decision fit her hands. Every task felt like a step toward a horizon she chose. In the middle of the day, when the space cleared for a brief break, a delivery arrived, a single box wrapped in simple brown paper tied with twine. No name. No sender. Elena lifted the lid. Inside was her mother's handwriting. Not a letter, but a small notebook Elena had never seen, bound in worn leather, smelling faintly of old cedar and lavender. On the first page, "For when you become the woman you were meant to be." Her breath caught. She turned the page. Her mother had written reflections, insights about strength, boundaries, love, silence, courage. Lessons Elena's younger self wouldn't have understood. Lessons her older self needed today. It was as though her mother had written a manual for the woman she hoped Elena would one day permit herself to become. As she read, one line struck her with the force of truth. When you reclaim your life, you must then choose what you will offer the world. It was the exact question she had been answering since the divorce. By the time she closed the notebook, her decision was solidified. This foundation wasn't just an initiative. It was her life's work. Afternoon arrived with a different energy, anticipation wrapped in soft intensity. The first official session of the foundation gathered 20 women around the long wooden table, women of different ages, backgrounds, and stories. Some arrived clutching notebooks like lifelines. Some carried the calm of quiet competence. Some had wounds just beneath the surface. All carried brilliance. Elena stood at the head of the table, not because hierarchy demanded it, but because the moment had invited her there. "Welcome," she said, her voice steady and warm. "Today is not about what you've lost or what you fear. Today is about what you're about to build." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room leaned toward her, listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for truth. This is not a school. This is not a charity. This is not a reaction to a world that has overlooked us. This is an institution for power. Quiet power. Ethical power. Strategic power. Your power. Eyes filled. Hearts aligned. You will learn here what others never thought you needed to know. You will learn how to protect yourselves, your assets, your futures, your stories. You will build structures no one can dismantle. You will never again doubt your right to safety or success. Her voice dropped softer. And when you leave here, you will not be the same. The women absorbed every word. Some nodded. Some wiped tears. One whispered, "Thank you," under her breath. The rest of the session unfolded with a kind of magic. Questions, confessions, business plans, fears spoken aloud for the first time, strategies crafted in real time. Elena listened more than she talked. She didn't want to be a figurehead. She wanted to be a facilitator, a guide, a mirror showing these women what they already held. Hours passed unnoticed. By the time the sun dipped low, casting amber light across the warehouse floor, the first session ended. The women hugged each other, exchanged numbers, promised to return. As they filed out, Clara stood beside her, eyes shining. "You know this is going to change the world, right?" she said quietly. Elena looked out at the darkness flickering to life. "I know it's going to change theirs," she said. "That's enough." Clara smiled. "And yours?" Elena didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, but because the answer was written on her face. Later, when the warehouse finally quieted, Elena stayed behind. She walked slowly through the space, letting her fingers trace the rough brick, the wooden beams, the chairs left slightly askew. She paused at the window where the last streak of twilight glowed. Her life, once fused to a man who underestimated her, had expanded into something immeasurable. Not revenge. Not recovery. Revelation. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. One final message for the night. "Julian." She hesitated, then opened it. "I heard about the foundation. It suits you. I hope you find what I never knew how to give you." She stared at the words, feeling nothing sharp. No bitterness, no ache, no longing. Just acceptance. Closure. She typed one sentence back. "I already have." Then she put her phone away and turned off the lights, the warehouse glowing briefly before settling into darkness. As she walked toward the door, her shadow stretched before her, long, elegant, whole. A woman unbroken. A woman unhidden. A woman finally, fully, undeniably herself. He planned to leave her with nothing, but in the end, he gave her the one thing she had forgotten she was allowed to claim, herself. And when she stepped into the world without his shadow stretching across her path, she did not rise like a flame. She rose like dawn, slowly, steadily, illuminating everything she touched. For years she had built empires in silence. Now she built futures in her own name. And the world finally learned to